Christopher Dummitt is a Canadian historian whose research has reached the floor of Parliament. He's one of the few academics willing to speak out about a silent crisis infecting our most trusted institutions. This is what happens when debate is silenced.
We found that the Canadian reality of political diversity on campus was very little. 88% of professors chose that they were on the left. Even doing the survey, asking professors a series of questions about these things, created a huge blowback. Even talking about it is considered to be a political act. It shouldn't be.
So then how did you get to the Parliament?
A significant chunk of the Canadian public, they don't actually see the full discussion and debate. They castigate certain viewpoints. They delegitimize them. The problem in Canada is that we have a series of institutions who say they are mainstream, but they don't. In that kind of context, a crazy person could think we need to eliminate someone. The way in which DEI works, it embeds a kind of political discrimination within university research funding. So it's a kind of systemic discrimination in its own right.
Have we as a society been able to effectively move on from that old model for racism? Is there something we're missing?
It's a travesty.
So the first time I came across your work, it was in the recording that MLI had put on YouTube, and that was you at the Parliament. That was a few years ago. And you were defending, the title of that video was actually The Absence of the Diversity of Thoughts in a Canadian Institution. But I want us to just start from that angle. I know you've written extensively about many other adjacent or similar thoughts over the time, even since that time. But let's just start from there. Can you walk me through and walk everyone that's watching this and listening to this through what led to that event where you were called to the Parliament?
Sure. I mean, I suppose it started with a hunch and a feeling from looking around myself in universities that I just noticed that there weren't a lot of people who were conservatives. But even before that, I would say people who could look around and question some of the key assumptions in different disciplines and subdisciplines, perspectives on the social construction of gender, which had been my own background. And I began to wonder what mistakes I had made in the research, what questions weren't asked of me. And I thought there were a lot of things that weren't asked of me. And I looked around and I thought it seems to be a bigger crisis in general. I remember in early Twitter making comments, there was not a lot of political diversity on Canadian campuses. And I would get some pushback from people who said, oh, what are you talking about? There's all kinds of, I know a conservative, yeah, as if one single conservative was enough. And I increasingly thought that didn't make sense to me. I knew that there had been international data, international surveys that were being done, but the US, the UK, and elsewhere. But I couldn't find a lot of good Canadian data. So a colleague at Concordia University, Zachary Batterson, who's a data scientist, he and I got together and decided that we would actually do a survey. We applied for and got some research funding from the Heterodox Academy, a US-based organization that was interested in the term, it put on the map, viewpoint diversity. And we did a survey of Canadian professors. I would say two things came out of that, right? On the one hand, we found to a certain extent what we expected, that the Canadian reality of political diversity on campus was very little. In other words, to say, Canadian universities were just pretty homogenous institutions. If you ask people to identify on the right or the left, 88% of professors chose that they were on the left. And if you asked who they voted for, it was a bit lower than that, maybe 78 or 80% people voted for kind of left-leaning parties. And we thought we should know about that. And then the other thing we found is that even doing the survey, asking professors a series of questions about these things, maybe about the downside of that. And we are also asking about the extent to which people self-censored, whether they felt they could approach controversial topics, created a huge blowback from certain academics, from certain kind of academics who identified as on the left and identified as activists. They contacted our universities. They tried to get the research shut down. Luckily supported by my university, but it created a huge burden for us to go back to the research office and go back and say, justify the research we were doing. So even just asking, these questions was too much for some academics to put up with. So I think that's kind of two problems. One, there's the problem that it exists. And the second one is that even talking about it is sort of considered to be a political act, which it shouldn't be.
So then how did you get to the Parliament?
We did a report that came out with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which kind of showed these details. And again, others were doing similar work at the same time. And then so it was in late 2024, Conservative MP and a Bloc Québécois MP on the Science and Research Committee that was looking into these issues asked me and a number of other scholars to go and talk to the committee. I'm not sure when these videos will come out. I'm actually appearing again before the committee next week, next on Monday.
Interesting. I would actually be interested to see what comes out of that. So you showed up before the parliament, and I read the entirety of the report the UN Zachary Patterson wrote about this topic. And I think there's a lot of damning, if I could say damning, findings that you had there. Not that they were totally unexpected or surprising, but it's damning enough. Yes, it warrants a lot of public engagement, maybe even media engagement. Did you get any media engagement since that time over this topic?
On those topics, we did, but I would say it was sadly quite partisan, which is to say, right-leaning institutions, obviously like the National Post, but other kind of radio programs were quite keen to talk to us. But the report was essentially ignored by other media outlets altogether, which is, I think, is a sad statement. When we wrote the report, we did not want it to be a partisan document. And in fact, we found evidence that there were left-leaning scholars, when they too touched hot-button issues, they too faced kind of political blowback, questions about self-censorship. So I think the report shows something bigger, but the response in the wider media community was to essentially to try to ignore it.
Yeah, not like I'm surprised. On one hand, you embarked on this research and then you faced a pushback. From the article, actually, you indicated that the pushback you faced was from, first of all, from the online community where they tagged this a right-wing sort of research or
A right-wing talking point.
a right-wing talking point. I try to avoid those kind of mainstream language because it just makes you want to pitch red against blue, but it's okay.
The thing I like in the sense that it's funny and ironic about that kind of critique is that kind of critique assumes that everyone in the audience is going to agree that a right-wing talking point is something to be ignored. If you would say, is this a left-wing talking point? Is that to be ignored, or is that like a perspective? Is that another perspective to add to the discussion? But the very critique that was being made about the research was actually a kind of proof about what we were saying. The people who were making that comment assumed that in the university world, a right-wing talking point, everyone would agree is something to be ignored. And that depends on exactly the homogeneity that we were pointing out.
Yeah, but isn't that sad? Because going by your article again, you say there were 4 major categories that you looked at in conducting this survey, in addressing what's the role of university. One is to educate. The second is to do research and to advance knowledge. The third that you used there is social justice and societal advancement. And the last point that you raised there is to educate and train people for workforce, which in turn will lead to the advancement of the economic state of society. And generally, you say in that report that both the general society and the professors, they agree on the fact that the first priority is to educate. The second priority, they sort of diverge from there because professors think that research should come second place, and the general public does not necessarily see that as very important on the second order. And then the bigger divergence in your work, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that professors rank social justice higher than preparing students for the future in which we better the economic state of society. I think that's ironically almost irresponsible. I don't know if you agree with that.
Is it irresponsible? I think it fundamentally betrays the nature of what universities are supposed to be doing, which is to educate, to inform, to seek truth, being conscious that that's going to be in some areas disagreed upon, especially in social and humanities areas. So to suggest that a university's role is to promote social justice and to assume that people are all going to agree on what social justice means, to give it a singular political meaning, is to go against the role of universities to pursue truth and to educate. In fact, what it veers into, what it becomes, would never be admitted as this, but what it becomes is a kind of indoctrination. And that indoctrination happens because so many people within the institution assume that, or operate from the same assumptions. And I think that would be much harder to achieve if you just had a much more vibrant, diverse university community, research community, where you just couldn't make that assumption that everyone was going to agree on social justice.
So listening to your argument on the floor of the parliament also, one of the questions that came to my mind, and even going by your article, is what's the danger in the homogeneity of thoughts in academia? Is it inherently bad?
I think it is, especially when it comes to kind of pressing social issues, but really on many research issues. I recently wrote that peer review research is what we do to sort of justify university research as being incredibly valuable. We evaluate it by other experts, right? We get people in the field who have spent their careers learning about a particular topic, evaluating new claims, new articles, new research grants that want to say, what about this? Yeah, what about this perspective? And our claim to credibility, to kind of a robust knowledge, is to say we subject all these claims to robust peer review, the peer review of experts. And to think that a politically homogenous intellectual climate, which only includes perspectives from certain parts of the political spectrum, to think that that kind of community is going to have excellent peer review on any kind of socially divisive issue, whether it's the housing crisis, the way to solve the housing crisis, should it be market reforms or more government subsidized housing, whether it's the addiction crisis, how best to deal with that, whether it's the nature of criminal justice and the balance between the rights of offenders and the need for the public to have safe streets. To think that a university community, which is so homogenous and so devoid of one huge chunk of the public's opinions on these topics, is actually going to do a good job of peer review, I would say is laughable.
Yeah, that's interesting. The average Canadian is likely hearing about this for the first time, even though I think people talk about this in different styles. But hearing about it at the level of media engagement, this might actually be one of the first times that a lot of people are hearing about it. And they might actually be wondering, to what extent is this even an aggravated problem? Or is just, getting obsessed about a problem that does not really exist out there? I picked a few clips or a few portions of your article. I'm just going to read it to you. I know you're familiar with it, but for the sake of the people who are going to be watching and listening to this, it's very important to actually paint this picture. From page 24, you described why is homogeneity a problem. You said you actually argued to see whether this is a problem in certain fields of studies, maybe in humanities or in social sciences or in engineering. You said it doesn't really matter in certain fields, like in science and engineering. And I began to wonder about that myself. Like maybe in science and engineering, it's not so much a problem. But let me read this one also. In page 20, you reference that professors vote overwhelming liberal and NDP compared to the general public. So that means general public would actually have a more diverse voting pattern compared to professors. You said, for instance, in 2021 federal elections, more than 76% of professors voted for the two main left-leaning parties, the Liberal Party and the NDP, and adds that supporters of the Green Party and Bloc Québécois to this totals, both of which are also attract disproportionately left-leaning voters. Fully about 87% of professors voted for parties on the left. I go to the last part of that. It said this compares to just about 39% of the general public who voted left-leaning parties. Page 20 also, you mentioned almost 88% of professors at Canadian universities identify themselves as somewhat or very left-leaning compared to only 12% who self-identify as right-leaning. Page 22, you said the field humanities, science, or social sciences do not really matters. Professors are predominantly left-leaning. Page 22 also, you say studies in the US and the UK are out there, but there is an insufficient data in Canada. And then page 23 finally said the trends hardly show increase in profs voting left. And I think that's very interesting. You said while the proportion of professors voting liberals has remained constant, said maybe the Liberal Party itself has moved further to the left. I've lumped a lot of things together there. But does the field of study, the field of work for professors really contribute to this?
I mean, the question is, what's it caused by? Maybe that's where you're thinking about. Where does this come from? Could this be self-selection, or is it kind of imposed? Is it kind of the result of kind of discriminatory behavior, a kind of unwelcoming environment? And first of all, I like that question, and I wish that same question was used about all kinds of diversity problems that we face in our society. Whether it's questions about the certain percentage of different ethnic groups, or ratio of sex in certain professions versus others. I think that is the question you have to ask, and you should be open that it might be both or either, or may perhaps neither. Second of all, I think with the role of universities, it's clearly both. I think people are self-selecting towards professions, and there's quite possible, quite likely that people on the left are more likely to put themselves in the kinds of careers that are possible in universities. I wouldn't be surprised to see a bit of a discrepancy. On the other hand, I also think it's obvious that universities are unwelcoming environments for non-leftish or non-centrist voices, right? They're very unwelcoming. In our study, we found that close to half, I forget the exact number, close to half of professors who were conservative were worried about the negative consequences if their colleagues even knew who they voted for, right? So not their opinions on any topic. They were worried that they would suffer professional consequences if their colleagues even knew they were conservative. So in that kind of environment, people are self-censoring. People are not taking up certain research topics out of fear of the negative consequences. It's one thing to be a full professor with tenure like I am and speak out on these things. It's an entirely different matter to be a young graduate student hoping to get scholarships, get work as a teaching assistant, hopefully get a job, to build up a career. If that's the environment that someone is entering into and they know that what the consequences will be, or they feel they know what the consequences will be, the political dimensions of the university world are clearly policing and excluding certain viewpoints. And it makes the selecting out of universities a rational choice for a young potential scholar who doesn't think like the majority.
So, if this is very concerning for a young scholar, what about for the full tenured professor? Why care about this? Professors could hardly get fired.
Yes, thankfully, it is trickier to fire us, and that makes it somewhat easier. And that's why you do find someone like myself with tenure, with no hope of another promotion. I've got to the top of where I'm going to be. That's why it's much easier for me to speak out. On top of that, though, there are just personal consequences. There are colleagues who, once they find out your political opinion, will make you face social consequences. And I think you can't underestimate that. The extent to which people want to go to work, they want to get along with colleagues, they want their workplace to be a happy and healthy place for them. And the reality is that while some colleagues are going to be very welcoming if they know you're conservative, some colleagues are not. I mean, I don't want to get into the specifics on this, but I and every other colleague I know who is a kind of more conservative leaning intellectual faces the kind of social censure exclusion by certain colleagues because of this. I'm okay with that. I think it's worth still saying these things. But there are also still personal psychological costs that come with this particular kind of environment.
So, when you face these consequences from the academic community, is this from the faculty level? Or how do students also interact with people like yourself who speak deviating from this, moral
Yeah.
boundaries that
I would say it's mostly from the faculty, which is interesting in and of itself. In students, I would say around a few years ago, we're speaking in 2025. A few years ago, there were more students who worried about these kinds of things. And now I think it's slightly more relaxed. If you look my name up on Rate My Prof, that great website where you can go and see professors, you'll get some comments there that they don't like Dummitt's politics, or it's a way about my politics. Who knows if the student was even in my class, but they certainly know of me from, columns I write in the National Post and will make comments. Now, they're more than outweighed by the number of students who are, enjoying my classes or finding it positive. But every time someone like me goes into a class, you have to be aware, there's the possibility that someone is going to dislike you just from the outset because of what you said somewhere else. It's not a huge major concern all the time, but it's just a constant cost.
I don't want to get into the politics of this, but I find it's actually very related to this topic of conversation, the event that we saw in the United States. It's related to this because it's actually on an academic campus that this happened. We could say it's a coincidence, but we know that Charlie Kirk went to academic campuses for about the same reason that you're describing here. It's a challenge in the US in which the campuses also are a very ideological and a predominantly left-leaning, and students are also predominantly left-leaning, or maybe the loud students are predominantly left-leaning, we could say. And we saw the gruesome murder that happened to this guy. When yourself and other academics here in Canada see such, I wonder what comes to your mind, and maybe added to that, I did a monologue about reacting to the killing of Charlie Kirk. And one of the things I talked about is, yes, we might not have rooftop assassins here in Canada, at least not yet. We pray to God, hopefully not. But I think the same principle of annihilation, the same principle of cancel them, ostracize them, strip them of their academic powers, strip them of their jobs in corporate life, make them ostracized and abandoned by society, ridicule them, destroy their livelihood. It's the same thing that we find operational here. And I think that's just few steps away from becoming a rooftop assassination environment. Again, I pray to God that such never happens in Canada. But again, I identified in that monologue reaction to this issue that we're actually not strangers to political violence in Canada. We've seen such before. I wouldn't get into all the details now, except you want to. But I wonder what comes to your mind seeing such, and maybe people like yourself.
I mean, the murder, assassination of Charlie Kirk is terrible. It's a terrible tragedy. And I think many people can agree on that. I try not to get caught up in the online gossip and horrible reactions that our social media feeds give us the worst reactions, the positive reactions to that. Those are terrible. I think those people are in a minority. My main reaction to it as a Canadian, I think what I see as the problem in Canada is the way in which conservative voices, on a whole host of topics, are excluded from certain polite institutions, the universities especially, but I would extend that to discussions about social issues on the CBC, the pages of the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star. And certain kinds of perspectives are seen as too harmful or too dangerous to show, to platform. And so I would say a significant chunk of the Canadian public, when they turn on the CBC, when they turn on the radio or the television, they don't actually see the full discussion and debate. And what's more, when they do see it, when they hear about the kinds of people who say the kinds of things that Charlie Kirk said, it's seen as dangerous, harmful, as possibly on the route to someone being on the alt-right, or really a kind of like pseudo-terrorism. And I'm not an expert on everything Charlie Kirk said. I've seen in some of his videos, knew who he was, but I was not a devotee. I probably, if I knew all his opinions, wouldn't agree with all of his opinions. But I would say the problem in Canada is that we have a series of institutions who say they are mainstream, who say they represent the broad public, but they don't. They castigate certain viewpoints. They delegitimize them, and they do this all the while thinking that they're really giving the full debate, and they're not. In that kind of context, a crazy person could think we need to eliminate someone like Charlie Kirk. Now, I don't know the full story about who Kirk's murderer was and why he did it, right? We don't know that. I think my point would stand regardless of what happens in that case. But I would say that this is a fundamental problem in Canada, the way in which the institutions which pretend to be mainstream actually consistently and systematically exclude certain perspectives from the mainstream.
Would you call that institutional erosion?
It's institutional erosion, and it's literally the definition of systemic discrimination. What worries me is that I actually think there's a strong case to be made for, public institutions where the broad section of the Canadian public can tune in, can see themselves and think, this is where we can get reliable Canadian news and opinion, and where we can have discussions collectively together, where we can hear the best sides of alternate perspectives on political issues. I think there's a real value in having those kinds of institutions. Not that I don't like smaller startup, media organizations that are just giving certain perspectives. I think there's a place for that too. But what worries me is that we're missing this broader public debate where we come together, where we hear the full range of viewpoints and are just faced to account for the best versions of different arguments. And I would say some of our media institutions, certainly in our universities, that just isn't happening.
Let me argue for them on the other side of this conversation, or where you stand. Some people argue, saying that this is an attempt to fight against some ethically and morally indefensible stance that society had taken in the past, especially towards some minority groups. And they argue that it's actually very important to silence or to give less attention to, in quotes, traditional way of viewing life, which includes in the past, some of this morally reprehensible ways of looking at life. I don't know. Right? I may not have phrased that properly, but I think you get what I mean. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's...
Can I turn your attention to the numbers on the screen for a second here? Because it shows over 90% of the regular viewers on this channel haven't subscribed yet. It goes a long way in helping us improve the quality of work, the conversation, and the guests that you see on this channel every time. If you could just click the subscribe button button right now, that would be very helpful to bring that number down to about 80%. Well, thank you very much. Let's get back into the conversation.
On the surface of it, quite a reasonable critique. And I think because it's partly true. I don't think the CBC has a duty to mainstream, a neo-Nazi per se, that to put them on and get them to outline their perspectives. I think there are clearly political boundaries where you give people less of the benefit of the doubt. I think that's just obviously true. I'm not saying you make their speech illegal, but you certainly aren't going to platform them. And I think that's fair. Where that critique falls down is that it's being done by people of a certain political perspective who are claiming that a whole host of ideas held by a significant percentage of the Canadian population are just illegitimate in general. What's fascinating about how it's usually done is that the details aren't there. They're just presented as dangerous. They talked about this topic, but the quotes aren't there. The details that I would allow the readers and the viewers to decide for themselves. Is this voice really outside in the acceptable bounds of behavior? I see this when I broach the subject of, certain kinds of DEI issues with my students. The question about, what's kind of race conscious DEI policies versus, race neutral or colorblind preferences. And I see an amazing diversity of viewpoints on this. But I would say overall, most of my students actually much prefer the colorblind perspective. They're not unconscious of the way, what might be the positive sides of these other perspectives, but you see an incredible perspective there. But if you switch over to, certain kinds of, quote unquote, mainstream viewpoints on this, the colorblind perspective just doesn't get a hearing. People who articulate that perspective are forced to go toward to independent media outlets to make their case. It's clearly not a difference between old school racism and this kind of new anti-racism. It's a decision about how best to achieve a society which doesn't discriminate. It's not about racist versus anti-racists. In fact, I would say from my perspective that the so-called anti-racists, to the extent that they are pushing kind of race conscious perspectives, maybe not consciously, but inadvertently are themselves much more likely to be racist. That's a perspective that I know a number of people share. So if anything, it's a perspective between modern racism versus old school anti-racism and liberalism.
So weirdly, let me get a quick reaction to this thought. So when we think about the old school racism versus the modern racism, just to follow up on that thought. So moving away from the old model for racism and not veering into this new sense of moral disaster that we found ourselves, where every little thing is tagged racism in modern time, have we as a society been able to effectively move on from that old model of racism in your estimation? Because the argument on the other side is that we still have racism existing in Canada right now. Justin Trudeau said that explicitly, tagging Canada as a racist country. The Liberals in the US do the same. You go all the way to the UK as well. They say the same. Is there something we're missing? And have we really moved on from that racism in the way that you appraise history?
Things have fundamentally improved and they've changed. I think those who deny that are doing so deliberately to obfuscate reality. They're doing so for political purposes now. And I say that because we now live in a society where racism is essentially illegal. We have a series of institutions, legal changes, whether it's human rights codes, human rights commissions, the nature of our criminal code, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that have been attempts to try to eliminate kind of old school racism that is kind of endemic to human nature, where people want to discriminate against those who are unlike themselves. And I think justifiably, and with lots of good impact, from the 1940s onwards, Canadian society progressively began to institute kind of anti-discrimination pieces of legislation all through the society. Now, where the critics are correct, undoubtedly, is that this doesn't mean that all individual instances of discrimination disappear. I think that would be it'd be unlikely. But we've created a political system where racism is considered to be unjustifiable. We've created also a moral culture in which to be called a racist is a huge insult. And I think that's what we don't quite appreciate. I'll give you an example of I use this in a class I teach, the example of the swear words we use and what words are really off limits. If I wanted, in the past, the words had to do with the body, with bodily functions, with sex, with kind of, excrement and dirt and these kinds of things, right? There's a connection between what's dirty and impure and sex and the body and irreligion, criticisms of, in Canada, it was largely the Christian religion. Now, if I wanted to say to you right now, don't get upset, God damn it. Are you okay with that? Are you alarmed? Maybe you, as if you're a Christian, maybe you might be offended by that, but I'm not risking anything by saying that. I could probably even say the F word. I won't use the F bomb now, so I don't want to, I don't know if that'll throw off the YouTube algorithms. But I don't in any way risk my professional career by using swear words that would have a century ago been considered, unacceptable to say in polite company. It doesn't mean people didn't say it in their private lives. They did. What are the swear words of today that you can't say? The truly offensive swear words, they all have to do with identity, right? When people get in trouble today for using words that are considered obscene and impure, and I'm not even going to say them because I genuinely would risk losing my career, right? Have suffering severe consequences for using a term which was considered offensive to a particular kind of identity category, whether it's race or gender or, what have you. And that there is an example, maybe the best example of the most profound moral transformation in our society, which says that criticism of discrimination towards individual identities, group identities, we consider to be morally abhorrent. So anyone who thinks that Canadian society hasn't profoundly changed from the old days of a kind of endemic racism, it's just got their head in the sand. Doesn't mean there's not individual instance of discrimination. Doesn't mean there might not be some systematic instances of discrimination. But we have profoundly changed in most respects for the better.
Well, I'm glad you were not the first guest on this podcast to shell an F-bomb. I'm still waiting for that person. Well, let's transition actually into a thought that you laid out there, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is also a very endemic topic in academic circles and even in professional circles and institutions across the West right now. And I think DEI or EDI, like some would say in academia, stems from this sense of social construct that was instituted to address what we would tag the modern day racism in society. And you wrote about it. You wrote another damning report. It looks like there's no shortage of damning report coming out of your angle there, but you wrote another one, which is 40 of you professors who signed this report. And I'm sure a lot of Canadians have probably never even heard about this. Again, I believe it's because media did not platform this enough. The conversation that ought to stem from this did not really happen. And all of these conversations in these articles, actually, I'm going to tag them in the description for everyone that's going to be watching this and listening after to go grab them and read them. They're written simple language for people to be able to understand and digest them. Let's start like this on this DEI topic. How did you get 40 people to sign a letter? That means if there are 40 people willing to sign this letter that could have grave consequences on their career and the way people view them in the academic community, that means there are still a lot of voices out there who are in opposition to some of the mainstream ideology. But how did you get that to happen?
There are. Now, let me emphasize, I didn't write that. I signed it. So I don't want to take credit where credit isn't due. There are a number of people who are critical of the way a particular version of EDI is being rolled out and being systematically embedded in our higher education system. And in particular, in that case, talking about national research funding, Canada Research Chairs programs. And there are a number of people who are critical of it. I would say precisely because the critics aren't, and I'm one of these, it's not like we're suggesting we go back to a time of discrimination. We're not suggesting that, it would be good if we just ignore this discrimination that's happening and we kind of don't worry about the possible ways in which research might, reinforce, kinds of systemic discrimination. In fact, the criticism is there. We are saying that, in fact, the way in which DEI and EDI works in the research funding is it does two things. On the one hand, it embeds a kind of political discrimination within university research funding. So it's a kind of systemic discrimination in its own right. So when you apply for research funding at the national level, it shows up especially when you say, how am I going to hire research assistants? How am I going to manage personnel? And you have to address the EDI criteria there. There are cases, clear cases, where people say that they're going to adopt a kind of colorblind approach to discrimination. They're not going to accept discrimination. They're going to treat people as individuals, as to what they bring, and they're going to absolutely, refuse to follow the kind of discriminatory practices. The kind of thing that's been done to great effect where, orchestras would have blind auditions where the person is just behind a barrier and they're just testing them on their music. If you say that in a national research funding application right now to various bodies, it is quite possible, and this has happened, that you will be denied funding. That absolutely has happened. And many people will then, you got a couple of choices. Do you lie? Do you just pretend to believe something else? I think most people, that's what they do. That's the smarter career move. They say, I agree with this particular version of how to deal with discrimination because I'm a biologist. I don't really care. I want to study hummingbirds or whatever it is that they're doing, but it's not worth my time getting caught up in this fight because I might damage my career. So this particular version of EDI embeds a certain political perspective. And if you disagree with it, it has serious consequences. So that's one point. The second point is that it, by its very nature, is against meritocracy. It suggests that you can't openly evaluate individuals and people. You want to reward people based on identity and not the research that they do. And you see this more in the Canada Research Chairs program, where there are various targets to have different identity groups represented in the Canada Research Chairs program. Now, those targets come from the general population. They don't come from the pool of qualified candidates who could possibly apply for those jobs. Right. So it would be one thing to say, we want to see if perhaps there are some kinds of discriminatory behaviors that are happening when we choose Canada Research Chairs, maybe inadvertently we're discriminating against a certain group or another. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to question. But that's not what's being done. People are taking arbitrary targets from the population level dynamics, even if the population of candidates quite different from that, and saying we must meet the general population level, clearly is going to prioritize identity over merit. And it's a travesty.
I was at a university campus out west. I wouldn't say the name. Out west just a few months back. And I was talking to one of the directors in the Faculty of Health Sciences. And one of the things they identified was the fact that they've not had a Black person lead that research faculty since ever. And I think on the side of the DEI argument, I am mostly for meritocracy. I'm for qualification-based hiring, and I don't want anyone to view me solely based on the color of my skin. I want you to relate with me by my intellect and the character within me. I tend to be on the other side of this conversation, but one of the things they brought up to me, and I'm going to bring it up as a devil's advocate point of view here, is they've never actually had a Black person lead that institute before. And I know you're not familiar with this institute, but take, for instance, if there is a faculty or a department on campus, let's say your own department, where there are, let's say, Black researchers, Black or minority groups. I shouldn't say Black. I even hate seeing the world through black and white lens. But, for the sake of argument, let me say that you've not had a minority representation at departmental level or a faculty level before. And it's not because they are not within the department. They are within the department. They've just never led before. If that happens, their argument while I was on that university campus is it's because there's an implicit bias in the hiring practice. And my counter argument is this people from the minority groups, did they actually apply for it? And they will say, yeah, of course they apply. But I don't know how you view that, because this is a common talking point when it comes to this kind of conversation.
Yeah. And what I said before, and I'd say again, is I think it's incumbent upon organizations to think through if they are overlooking people, inadvertently. Worse would be consciously. That's how it used to happen, and it totally did used to happen. For female candidates, or I remember some stories in books about McGill saying we only need so many Jews here. We can't have more than a certain number. This is a totally legitimate concern to have. So I think it has to be done in the smart kind of way where you say, is there evidence that the reason someone isn't being chosen is because of their identity? And if that is the case, I'm fully in favor of saying we need to prevent that from happening, make sure that our, selection tools account for that, and that we overcome that discrimination. The danger with the way it actually runs out in practice is, as I've already said, on the one hand, you have to make statements of your commitment to diversity, and those tend to be politically lopsided. So you have to deal with it in certain kinds of ways, and those certain kinds of ways are far left perspectives about how you deal with EDI. So what it does is that then it embeds political discrimination in the institution, right? So that creates its own. So in the process of trying to deal with the diversity problem, you create another diversity problem. On the other hand, these institutions seem to be they're quite illiberal, and they're quite rigid as to who is considered to be a kind of deserving category. And I think these categories are often stuck in the past, and they don't catch up with what's actually happening in Canada in 2025 versus 1980. So an example I would give you, and this isn't to do with higher education, although it shows up in higher education in some ways, which is something that in certain circles people are talking a lot about, which is the plight of young men and boys. And the reality is that in schooling systems, elementary schools, high schools, and universities, young boys are just doing much worse than they used to. When you go out and look at who's enrolling in programs all across the university, except for engineering, certain tech disciplines, women are just overrepresented from the perspective of their share of the population. Is this the fault of women? Obviously not. It's not about blaming someone or another. It's about saying, here's a real gender disparity. And where is the curiosity to ask why that is? And you will find this discussion almost nowhere in the EDI circles at universities today, because it doesn't fit the categories of yesterday. So this is a situation where the people who are running these EDI programs come into it with rigid ideas about who is and who isn't deserving or marginalized, and they're just not usually willing to update them and really ask them as empirical questions. And that would be a more interesting, more useful kind of approach to EDI. And maybe the one last thing is that they're often not open to asking the kinds of questions that they would ask about political discrimination. What's the cause of it? What genuinely is the cause of it? Do you come into it with already thinking you have the assumption, discrimination? Or do you ask, could there be other contributing factors that could be fixes that we could do to fix this problem that aren't about discrimination? But the current version of EDI, proposed by most of its proponents in higher education, I don't want to say everyone, but most, is to say that you don't need proof of discrimination. The statistical disparity is the proof, and that's a problem.
Again, for every Canadian who will be watching this and people outside, in fact, I think I'll just take some of the points that was written in the letter, just so people know you're not making this stuff up. Here are a few instances. The ideological quotas in hiring. Your article or the letter actually stated instances where universities have restricted hiring practices to meet DEI quotas. For instance, a job posting at Laval University was closed to able-bodied white men. Second instance, the University of Waterloo sought professors who identified as gender fluid, women, or visible minorities. Another instance, the University of Toronto barred white people from a specific position. I gleaned all these from that letter. Then there's the ideological segregation, which the article points out examples of racial segregation in university life, such as racially segregated events, including graduation ceremonies, freshman orientations, and even student lounges and swim times. Then there's funding without evidence, where millions of dollars are being spent on DEI initiatives without any empirical evidence that they reduce bias or improve research quality. Let me read this one too. There's the classic case that was mentioned here about UBC hiring in accordance with UBC's CRC Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan and pursuant of Section 42 of the BC Human Rights Code. The selection will be restricted to members of the following federally designated groups: people with disabilities, Indigenous people, racialized people, women, and people from minoritized gender identity groups. Those are the classic cases that were referenced in that letter. One of the very important things also that I thought was very important about the subject of DEI is that even at institutional level and in corporate life, DEI in itself is a very expensive endeavor. It's incredibly, actually, beyond this life expensive. And I think, a lot of people should be worried. Worried in the sense that if we have to spend this much on DEI, at least we should be able to justify the results, the outcome. Are we actually making progress? Are conversations happening, diverse conversations in the real sense? But let me just state some of this. We don't have all the time now to get into some of these details, but let me state some of this. There's a ministerial office in Canada under the Justin Trudeau administration where you had an MP that occupied that position and was paid a salary of $300,000 a year. That office was scrapped in the current administration, but the allocation of resources is not necessarily scrapped. There are anti-racism strategy that we have in government, which announced in June 2024 is a $110 million investment. This is for a broad range of initiatives, not solely for the consultants in DEI. And then there's Black-focused initiatives, which government committed $872 million for Black-focused initiatives since 2019 until 2024. These two strategies, if you sum them together, the amount that went into it is in excess of $1 billion. And there are several others. This current administration actually is spending $500 million from 2025 to 2026 on DEI initiatives. So the reason I stated all this is your letter was written May 24th, the letter you signed rather, was written May 24th, 2024. And I'm wondering, I hope this is still a topic and we're not talking about issues of the past. And when I saw all this spending from both previous administration, the current administration, then I saw for real, okay, this is still a subject to talk about. Let's begin to walk our way home in a few minutes from here. If we want to solve this at institutional level, how would you address it? And are you really hopeful that the same proponents of these thoughts, either at academic institution level or even government or media or whichever, are we hopeful that the same set of people are going to be the ones to solve it?
That's a quick answer. No, I'm not hopeful. It doesn't mean I don't aspire to changing things. But here's what I would say as if I could change things, this is what I would do. Because I want to emphasize things. I agree with the principle that our institutions, whether it's our governments, whether it's our higher education institutions, should not be discriminatory. I would agree that they shouldn't embed discriminatory practices within the way they hire people and give out funding. It's one of the reasons why the list of things you read out there is so offensive to me. How would I fix this? What would I suggest we change? I would suggest we change it, not necessarily by eliminating EDI as an ideal and as a target, but I would suggest that we be very aware that our ability to have, say, targeted hirings, to say we want to have people from certain groups and not others, is on the one hand illegal by section 15.1 of the charter, which says no one should be discriminated against. And section 15.2 of our charter says there are exceptions for, I forget the exact wording, historically disadvantaged groups. And I think what I would suggest we need to do is put in an empirical test to say that if section 15.1, the right not to be discriminated against, is going to mean something, it's going to be robust, then we have to make sure that when we make exceptions to it, which is what is happening in affirmative action and these kinds of programs, that is based on real and genuine evidence of discrimination and real evidence that historical discrimination actually is currently responsible for current disadvantage. And right now, I would say the people in charge of making those decisions don't even think it needs to be a test. They assume that it's real. And, through federal bureaucracy, through regulation, they assume there's a clear link. And I think we need to be open that it might be a link, that there might be a fact that a group's discrimination that they faced in the past or maybe in the present is continuing to be responsible for why they're not being represented in enough numbers. And I am entirely open to that and entirely open to redressing that. What I'm not open to do is to assume that it's okay to hire people and exclude whole categories of people, usually white able-bodied men, though not only those people. And it's okay to discriminate against those people on the assumption that someone might be discriminated against, or past discrimination from someone's parents or grandparents might affect them today. I don't think that's acceptable.
I'm going to make you do this last thing. You've talked about this from the perspective of institution. One of the things I love to do on this podcast is to actually speak directly to people. And I know you interact with students on a daily basis. The problem we have also is the way we appraise life in modern society, especially in our Western civilization right now, which is rippling upon the rest of the world, actually. But the average person looks at life through the lens of, mainstream thought, mainstream ideology, but they never actually also stop once to actually question why they've adopted the school of thought that they have over time. But you being an instructor, being an educator, how would you talk to the average Canadian about this?
How would I talk to the average Canadian? I think I'd ask them to use their common sense. And I think common sense is a good barometer. Doesn't mean it can't change, doesn't mean common sense isn't sometimes wrong. But I'd say if something smells wrong, it probably is wrong. And it's certainly, maybe to clarify that a bit, it's certainly with questioning it, to not assuming that these job categories where they're discriminating against people to support disadvantaged groups. If that seems wrong, if that doesn't seem quite right, then I think it's worth asking. It's worth asking about that.
And I'm going to recommend that people go check out your podcast. I think you have a really very good way of carrying history across to people in a very fun way. The podcast, that didn't suck, right?
That didn't suck.
Well, that also
comma that
okay.
didn't suck. Yeah, it's a YouTube history channel. I think everyone should have a look because it's not political at all. It's just a great bunch of stories about Canadian history.
Yeah, I totally agree. I check each one of the episodes you've released. On a lighthearted note, I began to listen to what's the name of this old podcast that you recommended in one of your writes? And Dave the Vinyl Cafe, something like that.
Oh, the Vinyl Cafe. Yes, that was when the CBC did things really great. Yeah, it's a great series, a show that used to be on CBC Radio, which I have a fondness for.
Yeah, my best so far is the Christmas turkey.
Dave and the Turkey. Everyone knows that story. Everyone should know that story. It's a great, great story.
It's fantastic. Well, I'm going to end the recording here, but thank you very much, Dr. Dummitt.